I am Jim Collison and live from our virtual studios. This is Gallup's Call to Coach, recorded on April 9th, 2021. Call to Coach is a resource for those that want to help others discover and use their strengths. We have Gallup experts and independent strengths coaches share tactics, insights, and strategies to help coaches maximize the talent of individuals, teams, and organizations around the world. If you're listening live, love to have you join us in our chat room. There's a link right above me there to that to get you on the YouTube page with the chat room. And if you're listening after the fact, you can always send us your questions, and many of you do. Coaching@gallup.com. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast app, whatever that happen to be, Android or iPhone, or subscribe there on YouTube, and you'll be notified every time we post something. Dean Jones is our host today. Dean's the Global Talent Development Architect and a senior learning expert for us at Gallup, as well as the chair of Gallup's Diversity Council. Dean, it's always a great Friday when I have you on Call to Coach. Welcome back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We are in part 2, which we have no idea now after talking to you how many parts this is going to be. So I'm pretty excited. Pretty excited for that. But we want to go back a little bit to part 1. So maybe for folks who are coming in, if you could kind of give us the purpose and rewind us just a smidge on what we covered in part 1.
Yeah, no, that's great. And part of it was because we recorded part 1 first thing in the morning, and I was barely awake and pretty much nonverbal. So the whole goal of today is to make sure that things that I said last time are clear.
For sure. And I thought you were great, but give us a quick summary.
I will. So the intent here is to talk about coaching sales performance. So the intent on this series is when literally where it came from is when Jim and I were talking about what should we do next, right? Like, what should we talk about? What should we do next? One of the things, the first part of my career was in sales and marketing. And so I was a sales executive for a lot of years before I joined Gallup. My first role at Gallup was in business development. And then I transitioned into learning. And learning had always been a passion and an avocation of mine. But really, part of where I've always been super passionate and why I got into learning even at Gallup was my passion around developing salespeople, developing business development people, and developing consultants. So as we were thinking about it, we thought, gosh, wouldn't it be cool to do a few sessions on what it's like to coach sales performance? So how do you, in a strengths-based way, how do you coach sales performance, and how do you do that? And part of the challenge, I think, with doing that is always you have to kind of know a little bit about sales and about and what drives sales performance and kind of the world of sales. You got to kind of get into that world before you get really good at being able to do that. So the first one, we talked a little bit about, first of all, why coach sales performance, and I want to talk about that again today. We also talked a little bit about how sales has changed, right? How business development has changed, and how it's really shifted from being a focused on selling people or trying to convince or influence people to really become helping customers through and clients through the buying process. So it's really, instead of being a selling process, some of the things that now actually feel almost quaint, like overcoming objections in the sales process, right? Or how do you convince people? There's still that notion of influence. Influence is still a piece of it, but it's really around supporting people through the buying process and how do you facilitate that buying process. And then we talked a little bit about different types of sales, and I want to do a little bit of a rewind today to talk through some of these areas because I think it'll be useful. I love Andrea said in the chat, good morning from Seattle. Looking forward to the discussion. Thanks, Dean, for addressing this topic. I hope it's useful. I have read a lot about sales. I've worked in sales, and for the last, I would say, gosh, for many, many years, I've coached salespeople, right? So a lot of this is really kind of practical advice around what it's like to kind of work with salespeople, right? So to just kind of recast, Jim, I thought I want to go back and just talk a little bit, cover some of the ground we talked last time, and hopefully cover it in a way that's coherent. And by the way, if people are listening, I'd love to have questions as we go through this, as we go through this. One of the reasons I thought this would be useful for coaches is because, particularly, I think coming out of the pandemic, people are focused on growth. There's this great, I don't know if you saw it on Axios this morning, there's this great article on mega trends. And one of the big megatrends is just unleashing this period of growth, global growth. I saw China's GDP is up something like 10% coming out of the pandemic. Our GDP, I think, is up something like 3.5%. So I think as organizations around the world look at this and say, hey, we're coming out of the pandemic, there's going to be this huge growth spurt. I think there's going to be a huge focus on sales as an area for organizations to invest in, as an area where they'll want to get greater effectiveness. So if you're a strengths coach right now and you're listening to this, you may be working inside of an organization. We know that 50% of all of our strengths coaches are embedded in organizations. So there may be a focus inside your organization around sales. That if you're an independent strengths coach and you're working with companies, this is an area where we know that performance is easily quantified, right? So it's easy to be able to say, in some areas, it's hard to be able to quantify, hey, are people doing a great job? Are they underperforming? In sales, baby, it's just simple, right? It's like, hey, you're either bringing home the bacon or you're not, right? So because it's an area where performance is so easily quantified, it's also an area that organizations are more inclined to invest in. So if you're pitching coaching and saying, hey, I can coach people in your organization and it's going to increase productivity and performance and profitability, the place where you're most likely to have traction and where your performance, your impact will be quantified is that area of sales, right?
Dean, do you think that same thing is true about sales managers? In other words,
100%.
Because we've spent a whole bunch of time kind of focusing on the manager, and we're going to continue to do that through the bulk of the year.
Yeah.
But that's another pitch, right? Is coming in because the sales manager has such an influence over the sales teams. That would be a great place to start, right?
It's one of those areas I will tell you where great management makes. I mean, there's a lot of areas where great management makes a difference. Make no mistake, right? But it's one of those areas where great management just makes a huge amount of difference, right? I always think that managing, this is going to sound like a funny analogy, but managing great salespeople is almost like managing thoroughbreds, right? Great salespeople can be a little volatile. They can be a little difficult to manage like that. But if you know how to manage them right, if you're like a good, sales whisperer, you can get up under salespeople, and it's where great management really makes a huge difference. And so that's where I think, you want, if you're investing in sales managers being effective in that way, that's really helpful. The other thing I was going to say about sales and why coach sales performance is sales effectiveness is rooted in human performance, right? I know this sounds like a big thought, right? But, sales is all about human relationships. It's all about human relations. It's all related. It's one area. There's a lot of areas in your organization where you invest, and you invest in systems and automation and other stuff. Sales is an area where fundamentally it's facilitated by technology. It's facilitated by process, but really human performance makes a big difference. So if you're investing in salespeople and they are able to facilitate conversations, to be able to have more effective interactions with other human beings in other organizations, and clients, it's going to make a big difference. And so we know that when we're coaching salespeople, right, there's really two dimensions of it. And I said this last time, and I want to just make sure it's coming through. One is helping develop those salespeople to have greater self-awareness. So it's strengths-based development applied to the salesperson themselves. They develop greater self-awareness. They understand their own talents. They're able to deploy or apply those talents and strengths in ways that enhance their performance. It deepens their relationship with clients. They can navigate those relationships better, and we'll talk about that today. But the salesperson sees themselves and has greater self-awareness around their own talents and strengths. So they're utilizing those better. Again, it's one of those areas where you apply human development. You apply development to this individual salesperson, right? And he or she is then able to be more effective, and it has a direct impact then on the bottom line of the organization. The other aspect of it is, and where I think sometimes people get a little overwrought in this area, but I think that there's also understanding clients through this lens of strengths, right? And it's sometimes it gets a little creepy where it's like, I know strengths and my client doesn't, and therefore I'm going to somehow, psych them out, right? I'm going to understand them better than they understand themselves. And, it's like veers into the domain of trickery.
Or I'm gonna give them a free code, and then take that top 5 and develop a sales
strategy. Yeah. It's like somehow, let's use our powers for good and not for evil, people. You know what I mean? Like, let's, I think that there's valid uses of strengths when applied to clients, right? Let me be clear. I think understanding your client's talents and strengths is super useful, but it's useful in first of all, understanding how they think and what's going to be important to them, so you can deepen the relationship and serve them better. Right. And that's really where applying strengths as a lens to work with clients is super helpful, because it's like, how can I deepen the relationship? What's going to be important to them? What are they going to care about? Right? How are they going to see this? What kind of decision-making processes? So how can I, in service of them, facilitate all that, right? Knowing what I know about them. Right. So I think that's useful. So as we talk about it, I'm mostly thinking about the first bucket, right? Which is applying strengths-based development to the salesperson themselves, right? So that they're thinking about, they've got greater self-awareness and their effectiveness is improved. One of the things we talked about is, and I want to clarify some stuff I said last time. We talked a little bit about the talents and strengths that, regardless of the type of sales that you're in, and last time we talked about 3 types of sales, but regardless of the type of sales you're in, there's certain things that are sort of in common that we know make great salespeople, right? And some of the things we talked about last time, I want to talk about these a little again, and then I want to give you an example that I didn't talk about last time about how you start to coach people in that area, right? So regardless of what kind of sales you're in, there's 4 or 5 things that we would say, gosh, are pretty important to be successful. One is motivation, right? So regardless about the type of sales, you got to have some kind of drive and intensity. You got to have something driving. Motivation is just a key piece. One of the things that with sales is, and regardless of what type of sales you're in, you're pretty much at 0 every morning. Right? Like when you work in other kinds of roles, you come into the office and stuff's happening, right? When you're in sales, you're at 0 every morning and your job is to make things happen. You're literally creating business from nothing. You're generating from nothing. So you got to have that drive that you want to get up in the morning and go make things happen. Right. So my husband, this is a funny story, horrible story. My husband would kill me that I'm saying this, but my husband has spent his whole career basically as a retail expert, right? And recently, about 1.5 years ago, took a job in sales, right? And at the time he was looking at doing this job, he said, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing a business development job. I think it'd be great." And I said, "Are you sure? I sure it's really a fit for you?" He's like, "Well, I don't know. I think so." He's like, I said, "Well, did you like looking for a job? Do you like that process of looking for a job, like getting up every morning and going and looking for a job?" He's like, "No, I hated that." I'm like, "Well, then you're going to hate sales," because it's a lot like looking for a job every day, right? It's literally every day you start from 0. So that motivation, that kind of drive really makes a difference. The second thing is competitiveness. You got to, and I don't mean like the cutthroat, anything. You just have to want to win, right? And it's not, and you got to, and it comes from different things, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but you want to have some gauge on how you want to know, how well am I doing? How well am I doing relative to the competition? How well am I doing in terms of meeting their needs? That kind of, you got to have some of that little drive there, right? Doesn't mean you have to have the theme competition, but it does mean that you want to know that, and that's part of that motivation piece. The other aspect that we know that is in there is you got to have high confidence. And it was so funny for me watching the chat last time and then watching the comments in LinkedIn, right, about the session, because people really picked up on this piece, right? And it's that thing, I think I used the word swagger last time. You got to have some swagger, right? It sounds weird, but nobody wants a salesperson that is so introverted and humble that they won't like go tell you all the reasons why you should buy their product. right?
Mhm.
It's antithetical to the role. You gotta,
Oh, I don't know if you really need this or
yeah,
not.
stop.
It'll be
Yeah,
fine.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Right. So you got to be somebody that, you've got some swagger. You got your ego into the impact you're having and the difference you're making and the things that you're selling, right? The offer that you've got. You got to have your ego in that piece. And and to some degree, along with that, you're willing to take some risks, right?
Mhm.
You're willing to stick your neck out. And you're also willing to, you like that piece about knowing like it's on you to generate business.
Mhm.
Oftentimes there's
Mhm.
this expression that's used. We use it at Gallup that, great salespeople are like rainmakers. They go make it rain. Like
Mhm.
it's great salespeople love knowing, hey, it's on my shoulders. Bringing in money to the company is on my shoulders. I'm keeping people employed at the company today.
Yeah.
So they like that piece. Go ahead.
Dean, that word swagger really, it was almost like a watershed. Some
Yeah.
people really liked it. Others
Oh
took
yeah.
took, like, oh, I don't, and I think we think of that Western swagger, where it's kind of
Yeah.
like, well, I'm the sheriff's
Yeah.
in town kind of thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to, you can have relational swagger. I mean, if you have spent hours,
Yeah.
years
Yeah.
developing relationships with someone,
Yeah.
and you can say, we should do this, and they go, okay, because they trust you, right? That's a
Mhm.
form of swagger, right? That's a
Yeah.
form of, you spent all that time building trust in those individuals. And so it's, I think some people saw that as a very outwardly facing kind of arrogance, and
Yeah.
it comes in all forms, I guess, is what I want to tell people. It's that ability to say, we should do this, and then people follow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, I'm going to say something that's kind of hard, maybe a little controversial. Okay. I'm going to lay an opinion on you. Okay. Here we go. So I think it's also the way people relate to that is whether you should coach salespeople or not.
Mm.
And I'm going to say another big thing. It's whether you should coach leaders or not. Right. When we talk about swagger and that ego piece, I will tell you, I think all high achievers have swagger. They've got some self-assurance, some confidence like that. And I don't mean being a jerk or other words to describe that, right? I don't mean being egotistical. I don't mean being a jerk like that. And sometimes sometimes there's jerky behavior that great salespeople and great leaders demonstrate, right? But I will tell you, every high achiever has an ego. You got to fall in love with that ego and have space for that ego if you're going to coach salespeople. You just have to, right? Sometimes you see coaches that are coaching salespeople, and I also see this with coaching leaders, and it's like they're trying to destroy that person's ego or somehow cut through that ego as opposed to including that ego. And that ego is part of what makes them successful, right? And if you can't include that ego, if you're not willing to account for that, support that, and the right expression of that, then I just don't think you coach salespeople, and I don't think you coach leaders, because I think high achievement people are all going to have that, and that's kind of part of the package. And you see great coaches, and I've seen a lot of great coaches. I'm tempted to name a bunch right now, and there's a bunch of a friend of mine who's an executive coach at Gallup, a friend of mine who's an executive coach who works in the United States here. And you want every one of them kind of like something that ties together all the really great executive coaches is they love working with people who have big egos, right? They know that's part of the package. Typically, those coaches actually have pretty big egos themselves. You know what I mean? But that's part of navigating it and including it, right? So if you can't wrap your head around that one, it's probably not, this is not where you should go. You should go to work, right? It doesn't mean that there's not other people you can go to work on, but you got to include that, I think, right?
Yeah, and Dean, for me, like, I was in
Yeah,
sales, and I don't, this is not my favorite stuff to do, is the close,
right.
the high confidence. I mean, I have some of it, but I don't have
Yeah,
all of it. And I've shifted my career from being sales in that form to top of the funnel sales, with
Right.
high influence and getting crowds moving and advertising, right? Advertising and marketing, which is
Yeah.
a form of sales. But
Yeah.
it was really, really important for me to understand that shift. And I'm not going to coach salespeople. I'm not good at that.
Yeah.
Like I am way more good at the high influence of beginning the spin on the
Top of
top
the
of the
funnel.
funnel. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to make sure that people hear, and we'll talk about this in a minute, is some of the where that comes from. It may be that where people have their ego, they're putting their ego into things not like sometimes I think we think of it like like self-assurance or significance. Sometimes it's putting our ego into our responsiveness for customers, or it's putting our ego into how well we've served them, or the impact that their organization is having, or the deep relationships that we've built. So sometimes where that swagger gets invested is in those things, right? And you see that there's a lot of swagger. I will tell you, I think at Gallup, a lot of us have our ego into the impact that we have, right? And that's where that goes. I'm talking about the talents and strengths needed across all kinds of sales, right? So motivation, competitiveness, high confidence. The other is you got to be willing to that on some level you want to influence other people, right? And it sounds funny to say, but there's some people that are just sort of uncomfortable influencing other people, and you got to be somebody that you get up in the morning and you like the idea of having influence, right? You're a Jim Collison that gets up in the morning and says, "Hey, I like shaping what people are thinking about. I like shaping people's decisions. I want to influence that." The last piece, and this is a piece, I was talking with Kristen Berry, who's one of our gurus around our selection science, right? And she was talking about one thing she talked about that I thought was so good is one of the capabilities you got to have to succeed is you've got to be in sales, is you've got to be somebody that's good at setting up, organizing, and managing your work. Right. So beyond all this other stuff, you've also got to be somebody that, and you see this, is that you're somebody as a salesperson, you got a system and you know how to manage the system around it. You know how to be able to set up your work. You know how to organize your work. You know how to keep it going so that you're able to be responsive and you can move things through. Right. So those are the things that we would see across all types of sales. Right. The question then becomes, how do I coach people around these things? So how do I help people think about those things and think about how they do them? I thought, I'm not going to go through each one of those, but I thought I'd take one of them and just tell you how I kind of think about it when I'm coaching salespeople. So like the first one I said was motivation and to some degree competitiveness, right? So I am always looking for, when I'm coaching a salesperson, and I'm always looking for, okay, where does their drive come from? So where does that motivation, where does that drive come from? What's going to have them succeed and win? Right. And and as I'm looking at their themes and I listen to them talk and I hear them talk about the way they work, I always call it, where's their engine? I'm always trying to find their engine. Right. So the engine might be competition. Right. I know a lot of salespeople that are high competition. They've got that theme. They want to win. That's drive, 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 drive. Right. And that's the big engine that's pushing it for them. Right. And that's great and that's good. And I want to foster that and support them and help them get up under this so that they have that experience that they're winning every day. Right. It also could be something like achiever, though. So I know a lot of salespeople that have a high achievement orientation. So they've got a high results orientation. And it's less about winning over others, but it's more about, am I producing results? How am I doing? Am I got personal bests? And they've got that big achievement drive. For some of them, it's a significance drive, right? It's that ego orientation. It's like, hey, am I important? Am I really making an impact? Am I really making a difference? Am I center stage on this thing? That could be the engine that drives this thing. I've also seen salespeople where the whole drive comes from responsibility. The whole thing, and there's this drive for responsibility and the follow through and responsiveness and integrity around that, keeping our promises to the client. Like responsibility is the big engine that drives the whole thing. Could be discipline. It's interesting. I was on a call with a bunch of our salespeople yesterday, and like 3 people on the call had discipline in their top 5, right? And it's that kind of rules orientation, like this is what I do, and they are like methodical about it, right? And discipline might be one of the big engines. It's like, I never go to sleep unless I do this, right? I make sure every day I do this. And that discipline is a big engine that drives them. Um, Two others that I will tell you. One might be activator, that momentum. Dean Jones, activator number one, right? Like I always think when I ever think of activators, I always think of sharks in the water. Got to keep swimming to breathe, right? Got to have that momentum. Another one I was thinking this morning about a friend of mine who works here at Gallup, and her whole drive, she's been at Gallup for like 16 years. She's one of our top people. She builds these incredible, deep, phenomenal relationships with clients. It's like this deep relator, right? She builds these incredible relationships. I always laugh because like literally clients will come visit Gallup and they'll stay at her house, right? She's known them for years. She has she knows everything about them, everything about their organization. She's got these incredible deep relationships. So my point is I think you got to think, as you look at each one of those talents and strengths to like around that, whether it's the confidence thing, it's the desire to influence, the way you manage your work, or this thing about motivation and competitiveness, you got to look and say, okay, what's the big driver there? What are the strengths I'm using and talents I'm using to be able to do that? So one of the things I'm always, like as I coach salespeople, and I spend a lot of time in my life working with salespeople and coaching salespeople, is to look and say, hey, what is that thing that's driving each one of those talents and strengths? What have they got in their themes that's enabling them to be able to do that, right? So that's the first piece. Then I think as you look at, so there's some things we say, hey, those things are in common for all types of sales, right? Then as we start to look at the different types of sales, and I said last time, this is like an oversimplification, but I think it's a useful oversimplification, right? And I think particularly, as you get into it, I think it's useful to understand what are the kind of different types of sales. Last time I gave you 3 types of sales that broadly, I think I still stand by what I said. I think this is the way to think about what are the types of sales that are out there as you start to coach people. One is product sales. The second is solution sales. And the third is consultative sales, right? And so I want to talk about each one of those again, and I want to give you kind of a sense of a flavor of how I think about those when I'm coaching people. And part of it is understanding each one of those types of sales, right? So it's understanding, well, like what is that type of sales and what makes somebody successful there? So first, I want to talk about the product sales piece, right? This is where typically in product sales, I'm selling something that's a standardized product or service, right? And it's usually standardized, right? It's not highly configured. It's not created uniquely like that. It's a standard, it's a thing, right? Or a specific offering. We do X, right? So I'm selling it, and typically I'm selling it to an individual or a decision maker, right? Like when we sell classes, seats in our open enrollment classes, right? It's a standard class, and I'm selling it to somebody who's usually the decision maker is also the person consuming it, right? So that kind of sales, sometimes that product sales is also known as transaction sales, because typically in that kind of sales, what you're doing is you've got a lot of very quick transactions, right? So this is not a very protracted sales process. It's a lot of very quick transactions. I'm doing a lot of transactions, and a lot of it typically is I'm doing the transaction with the client or the customer, and then I'm moving to the next transaction, right? I'm not spending a lot of time on that. I'm doing enough to kind of get to close the transaction, then I'm moving to the next transaction. Sorry, I just bumped my mic. But like that. So the capability that I've got to have as a salesperson is I have to be good at matching the product to the person, right? So fundamentally, if you think about that, and you think about that as a thinking process, right? So we're looking at those 4 domains. You think about that as a thinking process. I've got to figure out, am I good at being able to match the product to the person, right? So I got to be able to know, okay, what is it about this? I got to know the product really well, right? But I got to also know the person well enough that I can say, okay, where are those connection points? So a lot of that is the thinking, that I'm doing, right, is to be able to say, yeah, here's all the connection points there. Got to get good at that matching piece, right? So with this kind of sales, right? And I got to be able to hear quickly, yep, it's a fit. No, it's not a fit, right? And I also got to know, hey, is this person likely to buy or not likely to buy? Because I got a lot of transactions to do. So I got to qualify and disqualify that sale pretty fast, right? I had one years ago. It was so funny. I was talking to one of our salespeople, and I think they were trying to they had somebody call them and say, and was talking to them about something, and immediately I talked to them immediately after they got off the phone with this customer, and I'm like, how you doing? And they're like, oh, I just spent an hour talking to this person, and they just wanted to buy a workbook, right? And that's typical transaction sales, right? It's like they're trying to think about, how do I maximize the number of transactions that I've got, right? How do I maximize those transactions? And how do I identify quickly, yep, this is a fit or not a fit, right? So I can complete that transaction. The other aspect of product sales is you got to have some persistence. And that's where that motivation piece comes in that we talked about. Is in transaction sales, because you're doing a lot of transactions, you're also going to have a lot of no's. So you'll have a lot of yeses, but they're not all going to be yeses. You're going to have easily an equivalent number of no's. So you can't, if you're somebody that, you're high woo or high harmony, and man, people saying no to you just destroys you. It's like, I got to know, I got to go to bed for the rest of the day. Right. It's like, no, that you just aren't going to last. Right. So you got to have that persistence that you're willing to keep going. So you got to find whatever that thing is and those things we were talking about before, you got to dig into where that engine is that keeps you going. And that's where knowing where that engine is going to help you as a coach to be able to know, okay, how do I coach that person? Right. It's like, hey, if I'm high competition, it's like, hey, Dean, if you want to win, you got to get back in the game, pal. Right. Or if I'm high achiever, it's like, hey, Dean, if you don't get back in the game, you're not going to have a personal best this month, right? Or if I'm high relator, it's like, hey, Dean, there's people that, are out there that you want to be able to connect with and build those relationships with, right? So whatever it is, you got to know where the engine is that's keeping people moving forward. The other aspect of product sales that I think is important, right, is that with product sales, you've got to be able to build a relationship quickly and move into the conversation about the match, right? So you got to be able to be somebody that can build rapport quickly, right? So we always think of the talent woo around that, right? Hey, I'm like, I can break the ice. And certainly there's those woo dogs that, they can build that relationship. But there's lots of talents that I can use to build those relationships, make that quick connection, that quick rapport, and then be talking about their needs and what the fit is, right? And so sometimes it's my leaning into my thinking themes, my expertise, right? Sometimes it's leaning into my execution themes, right? My sense of responsibility or my arranger, right? So being able to do that. So it's that piece about being able to build that quick rapport, being able to make that connection, and then get right into that conversation about matching those needs to whatever the product is, right? So that's kind of the world of product sales. Feel like do you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think the role of confidence then plays? I always find when I'm out on the road recruiting, which is a form of sales, right? The longer the day goes on, the better I get. And right. And then I start getting confident. And then that confidence, I think sometimes for me plays out in influencing who I'm talking to. So in the morning when I kind of don't know what I'm doing, maybe like you, kind of just talking, stammering around, right?
Yeah.
But by the afternoon, I've got my mojo and that confidence kicks in. Is that kind of, does that, those
aren't you high in woo?
Very high. Yeah, it's 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, should have been 1.
Part of it is knowing you. Here I am coaching you.
Yeah,
okay?
Right on.
This is what our coaches always love live coaching. So here we go. We're going to of course it is, because as somebody who's high woo, I always think about it like people that have this is going to sound like a weird example, but people that have like diabetes or have trouble, like you've gone all night with not talking to anybody, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
you go during your day, and the more you talk to people, it's filling your tank, dude.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
All that's filling up that woo, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So the for you, it's your swagger is part of that woo, right?
Mhm.
Is your connection with people like that. So we got to fill that tank, right?
Yeah.
So it's not going to be the same with everybody else, right? So that's where we got to figure out, hey, what is that thing where do you get your swagger from? Sometimes people get their swagger from, if they're heavy thinking themes, they get their swagger from knowing, right? Do you know a lot about this? Are you an expert around this, right? Have you learned something around this? It's kind of like, I love people like that because you teach them something new and that gives them gas in their tank, right? It's like, I got a whole new reason to go out and talk to clients now because I just learned something new, right? And so I'm going to go out and I learned it. Now I want to go share with everybody, right? So it comes from a different place. So that's product sales. I want to talk about the solution sales piece, right? So, and this is where and it sounds funny, but like we even teach our consultants this, right? Our business development consultants this, but a solution is really when you take a set of products and you put them together to solve a problem or address a need. It sounds like the simplest thing in the world, but in practice, it's like people that are great at solution sales, it's not just about one person, one product, right? It's about understanding the need and configuring the products together, right? It's kind of like when you walk into Best Buy and you say, hey, I need a whole new computer system. And they go, okay, well, tell me what you're doing, right? And it's like, you need this monitor and this computer and this keyboard and this mouse and this cool gaming chair and this, and if it's podcasting or if it's gaming or if it's, like doing video or whatever it is, right? They're putting the pieces together and configuring them in a right way to be able to address the need or solve the problem that the client's got, right? And we gauge that. So we gauge the success in that is not just you can tell there's a few things going on. One is, have I really heard what the client is saying? Do I know what the need is? Do I know what's driving the need? So one piece with solution sales is building a deep enough relationship. It's not, sometimes in product sales, somebody walks in and says, hey, I want a blue car. And the salesperson says, great, here's a blue car, right? Boom, match made, right? In solution sales, it's like, hey, I'm trying to optimize this, or I got this deep need, or I got this problem here. I got to listen to not only what the problem is, I got to listen to what's driving that problem, right? And I might have to be uncovering something that's underneath it. So you think about that on a talent or strengths level. I got to build enough trust and relationship that the person is going to tell me what's happening, right? So if that person doesn't trust me, or if I don't have a relationship, they're not going to be forthcoming and I'm not going to find out what it is. I've also got to have the thinking themes that I can dig into what that is, right? And the more sophisticated the solution sales, the more complexity or more expertise I need to have around that, right? The other piece is as a salesperson, I got to get good at configuring. And that's a thinking process, right? I've got to understand how the components work together, right? It's, there's nothing more frustrating than you go buy a solution and you figure out, hey, the components don't work together. Oops, right? Hey, that software doesn't work with that computer, right? Or, hey, that software doesn't support these components, right? Oops, that doesn't work, right? So I gotta be able to think through what it is. And the quality of the solution is kind of like, I always describe it as that kind of gestalt thing, right? Where the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. You put all the parts together, great, you got all the parts together, but the impact of having all those right components together, the impact of that is so powerful, right? So that you've got to have the thinking to be able to do that, right? And then in solution sales, really, it's what it starts to get as you get into solution sales is it requires a level of trust, because it's typically you're not selling just one thing. You're selling all the components, and it's typically more expensive, right? I'm going to buy more, and it's more expensive. I need to have that greater degree of trust. I might also, with it, depending on the kind of solution, I probably now have to deal with multiple buyers. And so in product sales, a lot of times it's not multiple buyers, right? And in fact, a lot of times in product sales, the buyer is also the consumer, right? So I'm thinking about doing a course, I'm buying the course, but I'm also doing it's a course for myself, right? In solution sales, a lot of times the buyer is different than the consumer, right? So I got to think about how do I build consensus with multiple buyers, to make sure it's right for the consumers. I got to think dimensionally a little bit about that in some level. The other aspect of this that requires some thinking and some execution is I may have to do some handoff. So there may be some sort of project management associated with implementing this solution, right? So it's kind of like, hey, when I walk into, I'm giving you simple common examples, but I walk into Home Depot and say, hey, I want to buy, I don't know, a new kitchen sink and countertop, right, for my bathroom, right? There's what are the pieces, but there's also the installation, right? And making sure that what do we do with the existing stuff? And I got some project management around and execution around this, right? So I'll make my point, and then I'll come to you here, is the level of relationships a little deeper, the level of thinking is a little deeper, the kind of influence I need relative to relationships is a little different, and there's some different kind of execution that's going to work there. Go ahead.
So Dean, as you think about a sales manager or
Yeah.
a sales coach coaching a salesperson,
Yeah.
knowing that this solution sales, and we're going to talk about consultative sales here in a second, but product sales and solution sales may take different talents in doing this. How important is it to stack up these ideas to say, no, I'm better at high transaction versus I'm better at higher complexity? And what kind of conversations go on there? And maybe that's good to save till the end of consultative as we just think about the three together. But how important is that?
I think it's good. The trap you don't want to get into is that some talents and strengths are only used in product sales, and some talents and strengths are only used in solution sales, or so, and down the line, right? So that's not where you want to go. Right? Where you want to go is to be able to think about how are you using those talents and strengths? How are you using those talents and strengths in that way, right? And again, there may be people that what you start to see is as they utilize their talents and strengths, they get drawn to a particular kind of sales, right? There's somebody that used to work here at Gallup that she was probably the best transactional salesperson that I'd ever met. She's just phenomenal. She unbelievable. But it wasn't where her aspirations lie, right? So she wasn't, and so at the end of the day, I think sometimes people have to kind of go where their aspirations lead them, right? And what feels right and what feels good for them. But and we do know there are certain talents, underlying talents, not strengths, but underlying talents that are a fit for certain roles, right? But as you're coaching salespeople, it's really about helping them to be able to understand what are my own talents and strengths and how am I applying them meaningfully in each one of those areas. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, that's a perfect explanation of it.
I don't mean to dance around it. We do know that you can do talent assessments to say, hey, I'm a better fit with this kind of sales, right? But in this domain, it's the developmental domain, right? Not the selection domain. In the developmental domain, it's more about how am I using my talents and strengths, right? The pitfall I think we sometimes get into is there tends to be a stereotype of what a great product salesperson looks like, or what a great solution salesperson looks like. Or you see this a lot with sales managers is they've got that glare effect where they're a particular way or their best salesperson is a particular way. Therefore, they think everybody should be that way, right? And, even if you just look at across Gallup and all of our business development folks, right? There are just all different kinds of business development folks that have all different kinds of talents and leverage them. And so the game is figuring out what my talents are and then understanding the sales world that I'm in, right? Am I in a product sales world? Am I in a solution sales world? Am I in a consultative sales world, right?
Yeah, and kind of a danger in the guru mentality, which is I was a successful salesperson. Now I'm going to be a sales manager. Now everyone needs to do my method of sales because it was my method that worked as opposed to those unique talents that brought me there. I might have a different set of tools that we have to figure out how to use, right?
Right.
To get it done. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Let me do this. I'm just thinking about where we're going to stop today, right? So, let me talk a little bit about consultative sales. I want to talk about that just briefly, okay? And then talk about how you coach, people around their strengths around this, right? So, because I think that's super useful, right? So, the consultative sales world, so you can look at it. So there's the product sales world where it's kind of like I'm, one person, one product, and we're doing the matching, right? There's that solution sales world where I'm configuring solutions. Consultative is really either even further upstream, where in a lot of consultative sales is figuring out how am I helping the client just define what the problem is, right? How am I, it sometimes is even, the client may say, hey, we're working on this, or we want to optimize this, or we want to maximize this. It may be like, part of my job is just functioning as an advisor to that person, saying, here's the problem, or here's the thing you need to be looking at now, right? To in your journey toward growth or expansion or success or impact. Here's the thing. And a lot of what I'm doing is helping the client define what the problem is, determine what the solution should include, and then before I even get to the point of what are the component parts of the solution and that kind of piece, right? So it's very far upstream, right? And a lot of times consultative sales is where, the solution itself or the program that we sell or the service that we offer is highly bespoke, right? It's highly customized. So it's designed specifically for that specific customer, right? You see very high-end consulting is this way, where it's not like we do this and we do that. It's because anything that you do that's standardized wouldn't necessarily have the level of customization that's required for that to have the impact that's desired. So it's really, one is it's that deep relationship. So it's in that world, it's being that kind of trusted advisor, and you've built that incredibly deep relationship where the client is willing to really lean into your expertise, whether it's industry expertise or expertise about that specific organization or that specific function, but they're really going to lean into your expertise. So there's that deep level of trust. Right. And that trust also typically requires some level of confidentiality. Right. So I trust you enough that I'm willing to tell you where all the bodies are buried. Right. I'm going to give you all the dirty laundry. Right. And I trust you enough that I can trust you with all that kind of stuff, understanding that you understand the context and also the consequences if there was some betrayal of trust in that way. Right. The other piece is that you have to have that thinking, that deep level of expertise, that you're somebody that is a good thought partner. So if I have to teach you about my company or teach you about the industry or teach you about this function, it's hard for me because I'm not gonna then turn around and trust you really as a consultant to be able to say, hey, this is what I recommend. So typically what we're expecting is some expertise or some background around that you can do that, right? The other thing in consultative sales is that we expect that you're able to innovate or create the solution in the program. So you've got that ability to listen, uncover those deep needs, build that trusted relationship, but you can then translate that into a highly bespoke solution, right? So you're able to be able to do that. And typically, because this kind of sales tends to be more complex. This is much more complex than just a solution sale. This is much more complex. It requires some kind of management or orchestration kind of talent, right? So I have to be able to envision and create that kind of solution, but it also has to be something that we can execute, right? And that I can actually lead or pull in the team and orchestrate the team to be able to do that. So I've got to be able to do that kind of thing, right? So so it's And so typically this kind of sales is much more complex. It requires significant talent to do this, right? And so you really have to think about it's deeper relationship, deeper influencing, deeper ability to think and to really think at a different level. And again, that you don't have to necessarily be an execution guru, but you got to be able to think through the execution so it's doable, right? So the piece I wanted to end with today, right, is I want to talk about, and then we'll keep going this for part 3, okay? But as a coach, then knowing those different types of sales, how do I coach people, right? Well, one is to make sure it's not like, and I said this before, it's not like I'm going to look at somebody's themes and say, boom, you should be in product sales, or boom, you should be in consultative sales. That's not it, right? It's really looking and saying, okay, given your themes and given the kind of sales that you're in, how do I coach you to be successful, right? Given what I know about that type of sales and given what I know about your themes, how do I help you to be able to do that? I think it starts for me always at the domain level. So I like to think about it. Like to start thinking about it in the domain level. It's so knowing that person and knowing this kind of sales, right? How am I going to help them think about their themes in a way that's useful for creating relationships? How am I going to help them with their thinking themes, with the kind of thinking they're going to need to do in this type of sales, right? So how are they going to do that piece? How am I going to help them with the kind of influencing they're going to need to do in this, right? And how am I going to help them with the kind of execution that's going to be required? So I'm thinking at that kind of macro level, that domain level, right? So, and I always like to the way I'm doing is I'm looking at those themes, right? I'm looking at their themes and saying, okay, how are they going to do each one of those things? So let me give you an example of this, okay? So let's take the relationship piece. Let's take the relationship piece here, right? So if I'm looking at that person's talent and against that kind of sales, I'm looking at that person and saying, how is that person going to build relationships in this type of sales, right? What themes are they going to use to be able to do that, right? Now, a place I'll start is the relationship themes. Do they have any relationship themes? If so, what are those relationship themes? And they could be lots of different, it could be like I'm using my adaptability. So I notice that they use their adaptability, that they're flexible and they can pivot easily with customers. I could use their includer, right? That the drive for them is making sure everybody's included, expanding the circle of people that they know, and that know and use the product within their industry or their organization, right? So that includer is kind of driving them, and they're using that to build relationships, right? Could be their connectedness. I know a lot of salespeople have high connectedness, right? They're able to effortlessly connect and network within a company or within a community, like an association or a geographic community, or within an industry, right? So, like I start to think about, again, I'm thinking about how are they doing each one of those 4 things: relationships, thinking, influencing, and execution. In this case, I'm giving you an example of relationships, right? So I'm starting and looking at those relationship themes that might be the things that they can use to build relationships. It also could be themes from other domains that they're using to build relationships, right? So we know that, that like the old joke, it's just like, hey, I don't have any relationship themes. Does that mean I don't have any I can't relate to other human beings, right? No, it's like I can use a bunch of different themes, right? So the themes I could use to build relationships might be my learner and my input, right? So I love, and I know a lot of great salespeople who lead with a lot of learner and input. They are able to get up to speed effortlessly on a company or on a customer or on an industry and position themselves as an expert. I kind of gave you an example of that earlier here, right? Could be my communication or my self-assurance I use to build relationships, right? So a lot of great salespeople lead with a lot of communication, but they build relationships because they can articulate needs so well. So I can listen to you talk, and then I can articulate your needs. And man, that creates a lot of trust because I feel like you got it, right? You got it. You can talk about it. And so I'm using that communication talent, that influencing talent of communication, right? To be able to build relationships. Might be self-assurance, right? Is I borrow confidence. You've got so much self-assurance as a salesperson about the solution and the impact of the solution that I, as a buyer, am borrowing your confidence about that, right? Could be some execution themes that I'm using to build relationships, like my arranger, my ability to think through different ways of configuring the solution. Oh, that doesn't work, or oh, that's too expensive. Let's configure it a different way so that I can maximize the impact or maximize the value, right? Could be responsibility. I know it's crazy, but I know a lot of great salespeople that the big driver for their relationships are just that they have such high responsibility that they're so responsive to client needs, and their service orientation is just huge, right? So let me make sure I'm clear about what I'm communicating here, because I'm not sure I've landed it exactly. But so as I start to coach the salesperson, I'm thinking about who they are, and I'm thinking at like, how do they do each of those four things in the domain? Create relationship, think strategically, influence others, and execute, right? And I'm thinking again about it against the background of the type of sales that they're in, right? So I'm listening to them. I'm listening to their talents and strengths, thinking about that, and looking at, okay, given the themes that they've got, how are they going to create relationships? What's the thinking that's required, and how are they going to deliver that thinking? What's the influencing that's required here? And how are they going to, what themes are they going to do that? What's the execution that's going to be required in this type of sales? And how are they going to do that, right? And the example I just gave you was the relationship one, right? I'm looking to say, what relationship themes are there? How would they use those? What are the other themes they use to build relationships, right? Now, I only know that by listening to them, right? So I'm listening to them, I'm listening to their talents and strengths, and I'm thinking about the way they use their talents and strengths and looking at how that matches this type of sales, what clients are going to need, and then helping them to be able to lean into those talents to really build legitimate strengths there, okay? So I'll stop there. Jim.
Yeah, Dean. So would I repeat that process then for each one of those other domains? So I'm kind of going through that and thinking, how am I executing? Dan Donovan was kind of asking about that question. I would say, okay, because to be honest, this is an area where I struggle, is on the execution side. Yeah. So I think, like, okay, how do I line up what I currently have to help me in that execution? In my case, I actually get other people as well to partner with me who are really good at that, to kind of help in that process. But is that what you're
exactly? And it's the thing you want to be aware of, like if I'm coaching you, Jim, right? And as a salesperson, right? And I'm listening to, how's it going, right? And I'm listening for what's working, and where I'm going to start to intervene is in those areas where it feels like things aren't working, right? If you're able to effortlessly create relationships and you build trust and that, like that, that's great. And then you're able to do that. That's great. I'm not gonna worry about like leaning into that domain. If the execution domain is that's where we're going to go to work, right? So we're going to go to work on, how do we think about your talents and strengths? So I always think about, where's the demand from their work and from their clients? What are the, it's what our experts like Kristen Berry call job demands, right? What's the demands of the job? Where's the demands of the work? What's the demand from the client, right? And where are they either not aware of those demands or not disposed to meet them, right? And figuring out how do we use our talents and strengths to be able to do that? And your awareness of the type of sales and what's needed there, that helps you get a sense of what those job demands are going to be, so that you're better equipped to be able to say, hey, what talents or strengths could you be using there to be able to do that? And I just use that. I will tell you, like I'm a guy who loves a system, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a good methodical way of thinking about it, to think in those four domains, right? To be able to think about each one of those four domains. I think that helps there as I'm thinking about it, because it gives me a place to be able to anchor myself. Okay.
You got a great example of that, and then we'll kind of wrap it. But 8 years ago, 7-8 years ago, you and I were having a conversation about Called to Coach. It was the early days of Called to Coach. And you were talking me through this kind of thing, and you said, Jim, I want to see 90 days on a spreadsheet. Like, I want you to start planning out, and I want you to have called the coach 90 days, we'll lock them in. This is the process. You said you love a process, and I've kind of discovered I need those processes. Like,
Yeah.
that's what helps me execute, is when I've created a process for myself.
Yeah.
You kind of taught me that. And so it was great. Like, I had put a spreadsheet together that, by the way, I still work off of. Like, it's got years, it's got the tabs, and it's got years, and we've copied stuff over, and it's messy back then. It's messy today, but it gets it done. I now have a whole,
Right.
I mean, I have all of 2021 planned out. The third and fourth quarters aren't as filled in but all of second quarter is, and that's 90 days. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's beautiful to see it. It's fun and beautiful for me to hear you say this and go back 7 years and go, yeah, that was,
oh, wait, he did that with me. Yeah.
exactly.
I think, it sounds funny, but it is that thinking process as a coach, right? So as you're in the process of coaching somebody, right? You're thinking through, and particularly a salesperson, right? You're thinking through, you got to go through in your head and be able to say, you got to listen to what that is, but you need some kind of framework or some kind of lens to be able to look at it through, right? Yeah. And I think that helps as you start to know, okay, where do I want to go to work, right?
Yeah. Well, it was great. You knew, as you put that out as a challenge for me, that I would bite on that. Maximizer would bite on it and be like, okay, game on, let's do this thing. So, Dean, as we look ahead for next time, where do you think we'll go?
Here, so a couple places, right? One is I'd love to. We promised this at the beginning. I'm sorry, I thought I'd go a little faster here, but we want to talk about the sales process itself. So the other kind of dimension. So you got the talent of the salesperson, and that uniquely, you got the different type of sales, but there's also the sales process, right? And and that's another piece that we want to kind of talk about, the stages to the sales process. So I want to give you I think about this in a very kind of simplified way. So I want to kind of talk you through that piece and then think about, like, how do you coach people around that? So I want to talk through that sales process piece. I want to start to dig in. We touched on it today, but that piece about, do you need sales experience to be able to coach people? I know that was a question that came up around that. So I want to be able to talk about that. I also thought it'd be fun if, I think we'll have enough time. I thought it'd be fun if people, after we've gone through all this stuff, is people brought their questions next time. So it'd be kind of cool if we did a little bit of a Q&A next time, to be able to talk about kind of what questions people have and are in this area, and we'll take a shot at people's questions. Right. All right. So does it sound good?
Yeah, it sounds great. Yeah, I kind of love the dynamic way we build these. We have some ideas of where we're going to go, but then the process happens, and it's okay. I think it's kind of great. This is so much fun for me. So with that, we'll remind everyone to take full advantage of all the resources we have now in Gallup Access. Just head out to gallup.com/CliftonStrengths, and they're available for you there. If you need coaching, master coaching, or want to become a Gallup certified strengths coach, or listening to this, you're like, man, I want to join the team. Yeah, send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. We'll get you all set up on that as well. And if you want to follow us on Eventbrite, gallup.eventbrite.com for all future events. Speaking of influence, the 2021 Gallup at Work Summit is coming up, and we'd love to have you as a part of that. The sales are rocking. In fact, we just did a session today. We just announced, if you register by May 15th, you're going to get a swag bag sent to you no matter where you're at in the globe, and it's going to include the new well-being book. So you might want to get in on that by May 15th. Gallup at Work. There it is. GallupAtWork.com. And we'd love to see at the summit some really cool technology coming from a networking perspective, Dean. So Abby was super excited to announce that. Find us anywhere on social by searching Clifton Strengths. Thanks for joining us today. We'll be back next month with part 3. We'll look forward to seeing you there. With that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.